brave thing to do, but I mean, thank heavens he did it, and that both of them did it, because it was so needed at that games to remind people of the rest of the world outside of.
That's right, and especially at a time, track and field was much more popular at that time,
right?
And there was less sporting events on television at the time, and so the whole world really was watching when John Carlos and Tommy Smith made that gesture.
Right.
Russ, one of the things that I always like to ask you about, because you're right there on the scene, is life on the border. You've been in and around El Paso, living up in Las Cruces these days, teaching at New Mexico State. When I used to go down to basketball in the Barrio, as you know, I took a lot of photographs on both sides of the border. And the last couple of years I went down, not only do I not have a passport, but people just aren't going across the border as much as they did, which has been too bad in many ways for both sides of the border, I think. But what's your take on the situation down there and people's attitudes? Well, El Paso is a precursor, I guess is the word, of things to come. It's, we're an international world, and that's a place where people of different backgrounds cross over, and for many years did so.
Yeah. Well, as you know, Mike, El Paso sits right on the border of Mexico. Juarez is the sister city. Now, Juarez at one time was about 1.6 million, and El Paso is about 800,000. So it's the largest international population in the world, largest population in the world on an international border. And in the last, just in the last 10 years, there have been over 30,000 murders in Juarez, maybe 30,000 in Mexico, maybe 9,000 in Juarez, and 3,000 in the last year, including 120 policemen, unsolved murders of policemen. It's total lawlessness and the breakdown of the social order, and it's, in my view, and in the view of a lot of people on the border, it's fueled by the United States drug policy, where most of the drugs coming through Juarez is the marijuana trade, and so I think clearly to people in my camp that if you legalized marijuana, you would have the profits of the drug trade would plummet. Now, there was a New York Times editorial last week saying, yeah, but that's only 60 or 70%. I think, as you're a businessman, if you chopped 60 or 70% of someone's business, it would drastically change things. And one of the other odd things about Juarez that people don't know, there's 3 high schools in Juarez for 1.5 million people, or what is now down to 1 million people. 3 high schools. And so when you're 14, unless you can afford one of the many high-dollar private schools, if your father happens to own a twin plant. But what are kids going to do? They graduate from high school or graduate from 8th grade, more accurately, and what do they do then? And running drugs is become a big thing. And one of the myths is that it's all cartels and sort of high-dollar Miami Vice kind of stuff. But it's your average kid on the street that's involved in it now, and that's who's doing the shooting and killing, is just kids on the street over money and turf.
This is the most tragic reality of our world today, is the lack of opportunity, or what the world looks like to not just the Mexican teenagers coming out of 8th grade, but all over the world, kids that age, particularly in the developing countries, that do not see a future.
That's right.
And it is a stark and terrifying reality of this world that if we don't change that, we're not going to change anything.
Right. And no kid, as you know, Katie, no kid in Juarez, Mexico grows up and says, I think I'd like to get involved in the drug trade someday. Right. And there's nowhere in the United States where anyone has said, geez, drugs have not come in this week. We're stuck for months now without drugs. It's just the drug war has been a total and utter failure. And in Mexico now, in Juarez especially, it's not the war against drugs; it's the war for drugs.
Yeah,
it's the battle to see who will control the money and who will control the turf. And the reason that there's so much profit is because of U.S. policy.
Well, often on this show, or every now and then, we do what we call the reefer report, and we'll talk about the laws that are going on and challenges and medical marijuana changes. Recently, President Carter came forth with a really a bold statement that just said that the war on drugs has been a failure, and he called for the legalization of marijuana.
Yeah, well, I mean, William F. Buckley did. It's not like you have to be it's not like it's not like you have to be Abby Hoffman to be calling for it anymore. I mean, people on all sides of the issue, and especially law enforcement, realize.
Abby Hoffman gave me drugs for my wedding present.
And there you have it, Michael's story on that one. Actually, I could tell you another Abby Hoffman story. He lit up a joint right here in this room.
And we had to get him to put it out.
I had to tell him, Abby, this is Chicago. We have a license. Could you do that where everyone else does outside? He didn't. He lit up.
All right, you're listening to Live from the Heartland. This is Katie Hogan and Michael James. We're talking to Rus Bradburd. I want to just put out a word of thanks to two technical guys who work with a big telephone company, a guy named Mike and a guy named Lenny, who, as many of you know who listened last week, we were not broadcast live. We had some technical difficulties, and we worked those. Some of that was paying our bill late. But then,
technical.
once again, when we got it all hooked up, we were having a lot of trouble yesterday, and I spent many hours on the phone with these two fellows who really walked me through our Zephyr board here and got the SPID numbers programmed in. So we got Angel at the board on one end, and we got Eli on the board at the other end, and we are broadcasting live from the stage at the Heartland Cafe.
I want to amen that thank you to AT&T yesterday. They worked hard, and
Both
Michael
union
worked hard.
guys.
Back to our friend here, Russ. Russ, you talked to me about the film you saw last night, Dave Zirin's film, and particularly we were talking about women in sports. Could you share some of the things that we were sharing earlier before the show started about what you learned from the Zirin film last night?
Well, all of us at the table, Dave Zirin might be 35 years old, and I'm old enough to be his father, but I've learned so much from this guy. He's relentless in his research, but what he does is he connects the dots in sports, especially professional sports and college sports in this country, and sort of this pattern of militarism and disregard for human rights and women's rights and that kind of thing. The film is an hour long. It was called Not Just a Game, and it's been shown all over the country to high school kids. Evidently, it's through the Educational Media Project or something like that. But one of the things that the film talks about is that when I was in high school in the 70s, it was 1 out of 30 girls was playing sports. Today it's 1 out of 3, thanks to Title IX.
Amen.
That's amazing progress. Yet the television broadcasts of these sports 10 years ago, it was 10% of sports broadcasts were women's sports. Today, it's closer to 1%. In this last year, it's closer to 1%, below 2% of sporting events. This is with 3 or 4 ESPN channels. And so there's this odd, as more and more girls are playing sports, less and less women's sports are being shown on television. It's an odd phenomenon.
Why do you think that is?
Well,
what did they say in the movie? What the movie makes a good case for is that the American male view of sports is women's bodies, and so if it's beach volleyball and swimsuits, that's okay. But if it's a powerful woman
Hitting a great softball.
yeah, or kicking a goal in soccer, or handling a basketball like it's a yo-yo, that's less appealing to the sort of the macho viewers and advertisers than there's an idea that women that women are supposed to be there's an idea of what feminism and what a woman's role is supposed to be, and women pro sports clearly shatters that role, except that they're not being seen anymore.
Well, there was just some recent news about, I think it's in soccer, Women's Federation of Soccer or some national thing where they kicked the Iranian team out of competition because they didn't wear the right foxy clothes. And then there was also some real public stuff about trying to make the outfits more enticing to people for television
I just
purposes.
want to say yuck with a capital
yuck.
Y. I've had it with this.
It's a funny
And I
thing.
mean, all of us have observed, all women who do sports have observed exactly what you just said. Oh yeah, if you can wear the teeniest bikini ever, even though you're 6 foot tall and you can slam a spike better than anybody, the reason you're on TV is that you're underdressed.
Yeah. Well,
I just can't stand it.
maybe something that your listeners
I'm going to go
might
bang my
remember-
head against the wall.
Something
Well,
your
that won't
listeners
help
might
anything.
remember is the NCAA championship games this year. The men's game was UConn against Butler, and I had to like prop toothpicks in over my eyes to keep my eyes open. It was such a boring game. But then the women's game, the Texas A&M women's game, that was an incredible game.
Yeah, it was.
It was just a much better game, but national television seems to be sort of missing the boat on this kind of thing. Even I remember, Michael, when I was in college, you'd go to a Grateful Dead show and there'd be 100,000 people there, but you never heard the Grateful Dead on the radio. It was as though the media had not caught up to what human beings were up to, and I think it's the same with women's sports when so many women are playing sports. And
Good
but
point.
if you watch television, you'd never know that.
Actually, just to inject, we will probably have the quarterback of the Force, the women's football team, Chicago women's football team, which has a 9-0 record, on this radio show next Saturday morning.
I've seen them. They play at Winamac Park, don't they?
And they're going to play
Winamac?
Boston next week.
Yeah.
They're into the second round, and they're doing great. And
They were here yesterday nourishing themselves.
yeah, they come in regularly.
Well, that was just one of the women's issue was just one of many issues within this 1-hour film. I mean, it was Pat Tillman and gay athletes. And,
What did Pat Tillman have to say?
Well, Pat Tillman hasn't said anything in a long time,
Right.
but just the idea that the U.S. Army, the U.S. military used him as sort of their poster boy,
Right.
and even in his death, rather than admitting a terrible mistake was made, they tried to, again, even in his death, he became used as a poster boy. And so really a disturbing, because he was a professional athlete that walked away from pro football, but had changed, his views had really evolved. And even John Krakauer, his biographer, in the recent book Where Men Seek Glory, sort of pointed that out. So Tillman was pretty amazing, but also how sports has been used to shatter the color barriers and move civil rights forward in this country was a big topic in the movie.
Well, Russ, you speaking of writing, you are a hell of a writer, and your first book, Paddy on the Hardwood, was a story of your odyssey in Ireland, where you were not only coaching the Tralee Tigers to a losing season and then to the national championship of Ireland, but you also were hanging out with Patty Jones, who's been on this show and on this stage, thanks to you. And you learned the fiddle, and you didn't want to bring your fiddle today, but it's a great book. I was honored to have taken the photographs you included. And then you wrote another book, which is really one of the most wonderful books I ever read, particularly around civil rights. It's like civil rights through basketball. And that's called 40 Minutes of Hell. It's the extraordinary life of Nolan Richardson. Nolan Richardson happens to come out of the Segundo Barrio in El Paso, black kid in a Mexican neighborhood, goes on to play at UTEP, went on, became a famous coach at Arkansas, had some controversy, and now he's coaching the Oklahoma City...
Tulsa Shock of the
Tulsa Shock.
WNBA.
So tell us about those two books briefly, where they're at, how they're doing, and then you got to tell us what you're doing now. What are you writing about?
Well, just as Fruitland Jackson is sort of the living bridge between Robert Johnson, so that kids can learn about Robert Johnson, Nolan Richardson was the living bridge between the black coaches who never got a chance at the historically black colleges, and even like great high school coaches in Chicago that would have never gotten a chance because of the color of their skin. Well, Nolan Richardson was sort of the living bridge. He was one of the first to get a chance, and not only did he get a chance, he did incredibly well. He went to 3 Final Fours at Arkansas and won the national championship. And so his life story is an amazing story. He grew up a Spanish speaker in the Barrio of El Paso, and so in a way, you could make the case that he's just as Mexican as he is black, but really a guy who knocked down doors and opened up. I think coaches today if you're a basketball coach, you can be less concerned about the color of your skin than you would have had to been 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. But you know what I tell people Katie, is the real impact for Nolan Richardson. If you want to understand Nolan Richardson's impact, the real place to look is in college football, where there's still 1% of the coaches are African American. College football has not had their Nolan Richardson yet. They're still waiting for a Nolan Richardson type figure to come along and break down doors like Nolan Richardson did in college basketball.
You are listening to Live from the Heartland, WLUW 88.7 FM on your dial, Chicago Sound Alliance. We are here every Saturday morning with fascinating, intelligent folks doing inspiring interviews like this guy, Rus Bradburd.
Okay, Russ, so you got 2 books out. Both of them are available in the Heartland General Store. In fact, you can get autographed copies of the Nolan Richardson biography. And but you have been writing a series of short stories, and I'm sure you have plans on publishing some more books. You are a professor of creative writing at New Mexico State, and you're there along with your wonderful wife, Connie, who is one hell of a poet. And I'd like to know what you're working on, because...
Are we getting beeped every time you say that? Go ahead.
I'm not sure, but
that passed over me.
But well, first, Mike, on the side, I have a little side job these days. I write for Slam magazine. If listeners are under 30, they know Slam magazine, but anyone over 30 doesn't seem to know. It's a basketball magazine. It's the largest circulation of a basketball magazine in the world, but it sort of targets hip-hop culture. It's a much more urban kind of chic magazine than, say, Sports Illustrated or ESPN magazine, which, by the way, Kate, a study in 2001, you'll be happy to hear this, Sports Illustrated had one cover of their 52 issues that had women on it, besides the swimsuit issue, was the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders issue in 2001. Every other issue had a male athlete on the cover. But I write for Slam magazine, which pays great respect to women basketball players, kind of a street level magazine. And so I'm working on a piece now about
get it here.
About Lorenzen Wright. Lorenzen Wright was the Memphis Grizzlies player that got murdered a year ago, and the case is cold. No one has any idea who killed Lorenzen Wright, but he was broke, bankrupt, and divorced. As it turned out from my research on this piece for Slam magazine, learned that it's actually a typical story that more than half of NBA players are bankrupt by the time they're 5 years out of the league. And a big part of the reason is that they have these entourages because of their generosity. They say, well, I've got to take care of the guys I came up with. These are guys I've known since high school. They're my boys. I got to take care of my boys. And so these guys have entourages, and then when the salary dries up for the main guy, as it did for Lorenzen Wright, suddenly he's got,
their blood dry.
Yeah, he's got 10 guys and 6 kids, and where's the money going to come from? And so that's actually a tragic and typical story of the financial stress on these guys, that you think that they're just all living this lifetime of being a millionaire, but they've got a lot more people to take care of than themselves.
Can I just ask, this week the basketball got locked out. Is there any significance for the level of attention you pay to sports?
Well, I learned last night at the Socialism Convention that we're on the side of the players. No surprise there.
Right.
But that most NBA teams, 22 of the 30 NBA teams claim to not be making money. And so one of the things that's interesting, the owners now are taking sort of a socialistic attitude, and they're asking to be guaranteed that they wouldn't lose money each year, which is a funny thing for a business owner to ask, to say, I want to be guaranteed that it. But
tell me who you ask for that, because
the players,
I'd like to ask that question.
They want the players to give money back, and so it's an odd thing. No one comes to NBA games to see the front office personnel, but the first thing that gets brought up is the players do. Many of the players make astronomical salaries, but your typical player only lasts 3 years in the NBA.
Same in the NFL.
Yeah.
3.5 years, and you need 4 years to get your pension.
And both of them are in these lockout situations as we speak.
That's right. But I mean, my impulse would be to side with labor. For many years the players were totally underpaid, and no one ever goes to a Brad Pitt movie and says, I'm never going to another Brad Pitt movie again. The guy's making $10 million a year. It's not fair. It's outrageous. And so I do think that there's it seems to me that when inner city black young men are making a lot of money, that seems to rile people up. But if they were making money in the stock market on Wall Street, what they would be able to do is if they gained or lost millions of dollars, they'd have another chance. They could regenerate themselves in the business.
Might even get a taxpayer bailout.
That's right. But the unfortunate thing for these athletes is that by the time 10 years are over, their career is shot, and they have no chance of ever regenerating their athletic career.
Russ, didn't you just go to a sports writers conference or a sports story conference?
Well, I went to in every year, Michael, you'd love this organization. There's about 30 of us. It's the Sport Literature Association, and it's a bunch of college.
It's like rodeo poets.
That's right. It's about 30 of us, and it's college professors who teach books about sport or sport and society. So I went to that, and I am working on a book of short stories that I'm hoping to get published. But as you know, the
You'll
market,
get it published.
Well, the market for short stories is not the hottest market in the world. But we'll see. Hopefully, I have great hope that the book will be published in the next year.
And
or
are
two.
you starting to think about another full-length book, like you've got the Patty on the Hardwood and 40 Minutes of Hell? What do you got besides your book on short stories? You got something in the works.
Well,
I'm
I have a few ideas, and one of them it came out in Sports Illustrated this last week. It's if you saw the Sports Illustrated piece, I don't read Sports Illustrated anymore, but the Barrio Boys was the story of the 1949 Bowie High School baseball team from El Paso. They were kids in 1949 who many of them had lost brothers in World War II. Yet when they went to win the state championship in baseball, they could not find a hotel room. Now, can you imagine your brother dying in World War II, but you being denied hotel rooms all across Texas as you drove to win the state championship? And so the night before the state championship game, they slept on army cots underneath the bleachers in the stadium. And so it's really
Wow.
it's an interesting story. And they were of an era where their coach only spoke to them in English unless he wanted the other team not to understand, and then maybe he'd shout out some instructions in Spanish. But these were guys who faced a totally different world, but in some ways maybe not. The last team from El Paso to win the state championship claimed that they were hearing the same sort of pig-headed racial slurs from the stands in 2009. 50 years later, we're hearing the same things, although I imagine they could get hotel rooms on the way to the game.
So did you? Are there any of those guys still around that you can talk to?
Well, there's 6 of them are still around. So I've only met a couple of them, but Alex Wolff wrote the story for Sports Illustrated. He's really a fine writer. He's one of the best sports writers around, I think. And this idea of the Bowie baseball team breaking down barriers seems like an interesting idea for a book to me. Now,
I'm looking forward to it.
Whether I could ever pull it off, but you should check out the new Sports Illustrated or just get it online.
I'm going to get slammed first.
Yeah.
Okay. You've been listening to Live from the Heartland on WLUW 88.7 Chicago Sound Alliance. You can listen to it anywhere in the world on WLUW.org. And you can listen to earlier editions of Live from the Heartland, actually see them on youtube.com/Heartland Media, or if you're at heartlandcafe.com, just hit the Heartland Media Project.